who, as I say, is very well known. He lives in Islington after, I think, a brief foray to Hackney.
14 years.
Oh.
And Tower Hamlets.
And
Tower Hamlets, not Hackney.
Well, he will tell you about that himself. Nevertheless, he's a very well-known figure in Islington. You will have seen the notice in WOW, which tells you that Bob has been a stand-up comedian, community worker, head of a residential field study centre, and the director, doesn't say what.
Islington Council.
Of Islington 4, okay, director of Islington Council, and more. And also in WOW, in our newsletter, you will have seen that he is currently running walks on Mondays.
Tuesdays. Oh, sorry about that.
It's very useful that you can correct this, because it says in our newsletter that he's running every Monday a nature walk.
That's why no one turned up to the
Well, now you're in the know. You can turn up for a Tuesday nature walk in Islington. Bob has some leaflets about that here. And he also has some books that you may be inspired to come and look at and maybe even buy. I'm told last time he was here it was a sellout, so maybe quick. So without further ado, I'll introduce Bob Kubrick.
Thank you. Is the volume right now? Yes. I should actually clarify that I wasn't director of the whole of Islington Council. I was a director in the Environment Department of Islington Council. The last time I was in this room, incidentally, was for the Islington in Bloom Awards last year. The last time I addressed you was not in this room, but in the other room across the hall. And I began on that occasion by reading some paragraphs from my most recent book, the opening paragraphs from this book, The Missing Mus. And I thought, with your permission, and even without your permission actually, I'm going to I begin this one by reading some of the opening paragraphs from an earlier book called Ghost Trees. And the reason I'm reading that is because they really explain what I do and what all of my work is about. And to set the scene, I had just moved from Islington to Poplar in Tower Hamlets, in the east end of Tower Hamlets. I had never in my life intended to live in Poplar, but my wife had been ordained as a priest in the Church of England, and the parish of Poplar was her posting. So we went there and we stayed there for 14 years until we recently moved back to Islington. So I have just moved to Poplar with my family, with the goldfish, with a particularly recalcitrant cat, and I thought I would use this opportunity because I'm a great believer in the importance of place and in being rooted wherever you are. So I thought I would begin by walking every street, alleyway and estate in the parish of Poplar and recording its wildlife. And this is how this book begins, or almost begins. I became the recorder of plants that grew in the cracks of pavements, or that lived out their brief lives at the base of a lamppost. I was the curator of ferns that frequented the wall beneath a broken down pipe, of birds that nested in gutter or garden bush, of spiders that span their untidy webs around the lights in a dingy underpass. I was friend to the weed and the woodlouse, the warden of moths and slimes and mosses. Perhaps I should give credit to the author Richard Adams, although in a roundabout sort of way, for the enthusiasm with which I had come to address this task. Browsing many years ago in a second-hand bookshop, I picked up a copy of one of his works. It wasn't one of the more familiar novels, Watership Down or The Plague Dogs or Shardik, but a more personal nature diary based on a year he had spent on the Isle of Man. The details are vague to me now, but I can... Is this feeding back a little bit, or... Slightly. Can we turn the volume down slightly, or... I don't know what your waving means, so
Yes.
Can I adjust it here, or is it?
That's better. That's better.
You haven't done anything. I've just looked at it. I'll keep going. The details are vague to me now, perhaps if I speak softer, because I'm used to projecting to big rooms. But I can remember placing it in the mental category of those idyllic, rural reminiscences that make you wonder where your own life went so dreadfully wrong. The ones where otters frolic on the front lawn to an isolated farmhouse, or life's major worry is the red deer causing havoc in the cabbage patch. What still stands out clearly, however, is the passage that I had opened at random. The author is forced to make a brief trip to London, and breaking off from his string of inspiring rural observations, comments rather sourly that he sees nothing but a few crocuses blooming in a dismal hotel garden. The envious in me turned to evangelical. There was, I wanted to exclaim on behalf of the city dwellers, so much more than that. I wanted to tell him of the black redstart I had seen feeding in front of a builder's bulldozer, of the pheasants I had found foraging in an urban allotment, of the skylarks I had heard singing in a landscape of chemical works and pilings. I would, in this imaginary but nonetheless animated conversation, continue with stories of Dyer's greenweed on an urban hillside, of the rare Jersey cudweed appearing on a busy docklands path, of the gatekeepers and brimstones and mint moths and Jersey tigers that have appeared in my own backyard. Should he still have been listening, I would have gone on to explain that this was not just about the unusual or the unexpected, but the pleasure that could be drawn from observing the everyday, the comings and goings of sparrows and starlings, the exuberance of weeds on a wayside, or the first flowering of coltsfoot on a pile of building site clay. There is wildness in these unexpected encounters of nature, in the unexpected eruption of nature into the everyday. And it is these small joys that we must learn to treasure, and to take them wherever we can find them. The fact is, the city is where most of us happen to be now. Sometime in 2014, the world passed the point where more than half of its population live in cities. In the UK, according to the Office of National Statistics, the figure is as high as 80%. For most of us, the city is our starting point. If we are to restore any connection with nature at all, it's in the cities that we need to begin. So, let me thank you for inviting me to speak. This is the third time I've had the pleasure of addressing you. Twice as myself and once as a kind of faux James Naughty, without the Scottish accent and without the politics. Actually, I have a dream, and it is this, that one day James will recognise the debt that he owes me and offer to do a talk in my place. And although I'm not travelling up and down the country visiting constituencies like he is, I have actually got a very busy summer of talks and walks. This is just part of them, which I'll mention if I can, towards the end. So I was a bit worried about what I could put together at fairly short notice for today, and talking to Margaret on the phone, last time I was here, I talked about one of the mysteries that I investigated for my book, The Missing, I've held this up before, haven't I, for The Missing Musk. And I thought that it would be an interesting thing to do, to give a talk that was based on a completely different story from within that book. And one also that illustrates this idea of finding nature in the most unexpected places and being aware of it and looking out, paying attention to it wherever you happen to be. So I'm going to do another of the stories from The Missing Musk. Now, for those of you who weren't at my last talk, actually I should have said, for those of you who had the misfortune of not being at my last talk, I just need to introduce the book. So The Missing Musk is a collection of 6 different mysteries from the natural world that I set out to investigate. The title of it, and the title chapter, concerns a plant called the musk plant, Mimulus muscatus. And the musk plant, discovered first in Northwest America, but it became grown all over the world, and it was famous for this absolutely amazing fragrance. And in this country it was grown everywhere, from cottage gardens to working class window boxes. One pot of this plant was said to be strong enough to scent out an entire room. But in 1913, all the musk plants in the world stopped smelling. So that was the mystery that I set out to investigate, and those of you who heard my last talk may remember, actually I normally work on the basis that 95% of the people forget 95% of what you said within 95% of a few weeks. But you may remember that actually led to the investigation of a real-life murder story. That was one of the stories in the book. The one I actually talked about last time was the confused identity of the lichen. And it was a story that led us into all sorts of strange places, to questioning aspects of Darwinian orthodoxy, to questioning the nature of species, to asking whether there really was such things as individuals. In fact, asking the question, am I really an I? And as you're now such good friends, I will tell you what the other chapters in the book were about. One was about the story of the yew, the enigma of the yew tree. Do you know that 73% of all our large and significant yew trees grow in churchyards? And the reason for this has been discussed for several hundred years, and the explanations proffered range from the historical to the downright mystical. But it was a lovely chapter to write because it gave me the excuse to travel around the countryside visiting different yews. The nearest great yew, just for your interest, that I went to was in Totteridge. Did anyone know that? In Totteridge churchyard, there's an unusual church there. It's one of the few churches built during Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, and this huge yew stands in front of it. Strangely, that yew has not increased in girth in the last 600 years. Totteridge was the nearest. The furthest away was a yew tree in Fortingall in Scotland at the head of Glen Lyon, and that is not just the oldest tree in Britain, it is the oldest tree in Europe, at least 2,000 years old. I must tell you incidentally, it's just outside a village called Dull. And as we drive through the village to get to the yew tree, there is a sign outside Dull saying, Dull, twinned with boring. Nothing to do with my talk today, but I just love it, twinned with boring origin. There was another chapter about something called star jelly. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of star jelly, but there's these globules of a clear jelly-like substance which appear sometimes individually and sometimes in great quantity over a whole area of countryside. It's called star jelly because it's been known for hundreds of years, and originally it was associated with meteorite showers. But all sorts of discussions now about what this strange substance might be. Anyone ever see the schlop bean? You've seen it?
I've seen star jelly, yeah.
And I've seen it just once too, so I must talk to you afterwards and find out what you're okay. Oh, you can tell me in the questions. But anyone know the Schlock B movie called The Blob? You just don't watch bad movies, do you? Far too highbrow this week. Anyway, it was the inspiration for the film The Blob, and you know the Blob came through that. That was how the Blob came into use. And you know, Michael Gove and a lot of right-wing and neocon Americans particularly use the word blob to describe things, organisations and groups of people they don't like. The blob actually comes originally from a convoluted path from this star jelly that you and I have both seen occasionally. And one more chapter is about microscopic organisms called tardigrades. They're at the large end of the microscopic scale, but tardigrades are all about us. There will be some in the gutters out there and some in the lichen on the trees outside. Tardigrades are everywhere, and yet they have this very strange capacity to withstand the most extreme of conditions. They can withstand above boiling point and almost down to absolute zero. They can withstand pressure greater than the pressure to be found in the deepest oceans on this planet. They can withstand desiccation, salinity, they can withstand being submerged in toxic substances like sulfuric acid. They have even been put out in space by the European Space Agency and exposed to solar radiation and to absolute vacuum. They've come back and they've gone on living. There is a theory, a serious theory in astrophysics called panspermia, which is the idea that life didn't originate on this planet, but it's been seeded throughout the cosmos, on meteorites or comets, and the tardigrades are held out to be an illustration of that. So, this is the question, are the aliens already with us? Do we actually have extraterrestrial life already on this planet? So, those are all the chapters, and I've let you into a big secret there. Those are the chapters, except the one that I'm going to talk about now, and I've chosen this one because it's an urban example, and because, in a sense, it's fairly local, and it's the mystery of the underground mosquito. I must tell you first, I must confess that I do have a particular attraction to things subterranean. I have had the privilege of exploring salt mines, of going down flooded tin mines, of going down working coal mines, I've been to Cornish fugus, to ancient burial cairns, to Neolithic flint mines in Suffolk. Some years ago, for our significant wedding anniversary, I took my wife to Paris, and we were sitting on the Eurostar sipping champagne. Well, I suspect it was Prosecco, to be honest, but anyway, we were sipping it. And she said, "What have you got lined up for me in Paris?" And I said, very excitedly, "I have got tickets for us for a tour of the Paris sewers." And she was not pleased. But we did. We went down, and we're still together. We're still together. And not only that, but we went back some years later with our children, and we all went again on a tour of the Paris sewers. It's a great experience. I do recommend it. I really do. And they're just opposite the Eiffel Tower as well. I've lost my place now. And also, during my youth, I was a caver, or a potholer, or if you're an American, a spelunker. And I have caved in all of the big caving regions in England. And while I was doing that, I made a special study of the wildlife of caves. Caving in the Gower, I found new roosts for the greater horseshoe bat. And I had a particular interest in the cave spider, Meta monardi. And the cave spider, it puts its eggs in a silken basket, and then they hang on threads from the cave roof, so that when you're going into one of these caves, the bundles of eggs brush against your forehead and eyes as you go through. I'm just trying to make this attractive. And I mention this as a bit of a divergence because there is a diversion, there's a local connection. We have no natural caves in London. Chislehurst caves are actually flint mines from the Napoleonic era. We have no natural caves in London, but the cave spider has found its way to London. Anyone know where you'd find it? No, it's in the catacombs at Highgate Cemetery. And if you go on one of the wonderful tours of the cemetery, paid tours, they will show you the egg cases of Meta monardi in the catacombs at Highgate Cemetery. So, with this joint passion for the natural world of the underground, when I began to hear stories of these subterranean mosquitoes, it was an obvious attraction to me. And yet, despite being a frequent passenger on the underground, I had never seen one. So, was this just an urban myth, or is it true? Are there populations of mosquitoes living out their entire lives in the London Underground? And if so, how did they get there? How did they survive? And what does it tell us again about evolution? I realise I've got a bit of a task ahead of me trying to interest and excite you about mosquitoes. And it's even worse than that. I'm going to begin by waxing lyrical about mosquitoes. Because on the one hand, these are, I admit, they've been described as the most dangerous animal in the world. They are the vector, as you know, for malaria. And not just for malaria incidentally, but for a whole litany of tropical diseases. For yellow fever, dengue fever, West Nile fever, Lassa fever, encephalitis, elephantitis, Zika virus, Mayora virus, chikungunya. But more deaths are supposed to have arisen, it is argued, from malaria than any other, across history, more deaths from malaria than any other single cause, including human activity. I'm getting that feedback again. Can I turn this down in any way? Is there a knob that... where's my sound person here? Oh, he's gone, he rigged me up and disappeared. Is it all right?
Do you want to try it without...
Shall we?
Would you rather?
Can you hear me if I raise my voice like this? No, I can't. Oh, hand mic. Let's try hand mic. Let's try hand mic. That's much more than hand mic, I guess. Right. That's better, isn't it? Except I think if I turn my face away, anyway, I'll keep pointing that. Good. So I was talking about the downside of the mosquito, if you like. More deaths probably arisen across human history from malaria than any other single cause, including the nefarious activities of humans. And yet, on the other hand, you have to admit that this is a marvellous piece of evolutionary engineering. It is, in the words of the Psalms, fearfully and wonderfully made. take its legs. Now, we have as human beings a bit of a horror of long-legged creatures, don't we? Of house spiders, crane flies, harvestmen. Do you remember that Scottish prayer? From gowlies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night, may the good Lord protect us. We have this horror of long-legged things, and yet in the mosquito, these long sprawling legs have a function. They raise the centre of gravity, they reduce the weight, as it were, so that you are less aware of the mosquito when it alights on you, which facilitates its feeding on you before it's detected. I actually first came across this theory in a poem by D.H. Lawrence. Do you know D.H. Lawrence has written a poem called The Mosquito? It's a long, sprawling poem itself, but he says, "Stand on me weightless, you phantoms." So even the long legs have a function. But then there's the wings. Now, do you know that the sound of the mosquito, that persistent, irritating humming, is not a mechanical noise? Sorry, it's not a vocalization. It's a mechanical sound. It's made by the rubbing of the wings against a cone-like structure on the insect's abdomen. A fact that was discovered in 1902 by British researchers. And it plays an important role in the mating ritual of the mosquito. The female mosquito vibrates her wings no less than 600 times a second. The male mosquito vibrates his wings at a slightly slower rate, meaning that his whine has a different pitch from the female. And the female mosquito, by listening to the pitch, is able not only to detect what species a mosquito belongs to, but to locate the male. Incidentally, mating takes place. The males form these great, you might have seen this, they form these great columns, which looks from a distance like smoke. Sorry, I've got to remember to hold this up here, which looks from a distance like smoke. In fact, there's a story I came across, I think it's from the Franco-Prussian War, of a church in a village where munitions have been stored. And there's a cloud of mosquitoes rising above it, and the villagers think it's smoke, and the whole village is evacuated until an entomologist turns up and says, "No, that's not smoke, that's male mosquitoes." Anyway, that's another digression. The females approach the males, and as they approach, she slows down her wing beat a little bit, and he increases his wing beat a little bit until their pitches match. And when the pitch matches, they mate. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the love song of the mosquito. That is the wings. But you know, the most amazing part of the mosquito, the most amazing part of it is the mouth. The proboscis, the mouth. When I started investigating mosquitoes, I assumed in my naivety, as you probably do, that the mouth, a simple tube, stick it in, suck, pull it out again. In fact, the mouth of the mosquito has no less than 6 separate parts, all enclosed in a retractable sheath. So the sheath comes down, and the first 2 parts go in, and the first 2 parts have a serrated edge, so sharp that you can't even feel them as they cut into you with a zigzag motion. Once they've cut into you, they retract those parts, and 2 more came out, and they are like the retractors used by surgeons. And you've all seen this on TV, hospital dramas. They put the retractors in and they hold the 2 sides of the wound open. And then the 5th part comes in. That is the sucking tube. It has to be tough, but at the same time it has to be flexible enough to move around to find a vein. And it has special detectors in its tip that guides it to a vein. And finally, the 6th part comes in, and that is the part that releases a saliva. That saliva is an anticoagulant to make sure the blood keeps flowing and to reduce the time that the mosquito needs to spend on you. And as you probably know, it's the coagulant, the anticoagulant I should say, that causes the irritation and the nasty bump that some people get afterwards. During that feed, the mosquito will take in 3 times its own body weight of blood. Such gouging, such obscenity of trespass, said D.H. Lawrence in his poem about the mosquito. But not only that, while it is taking that blood, it is extracting the water and excreting the water so that it can condense the blood and get more and more into its body. And the mosquito actually has another chemical signal that tells it when to stop feeding. And one researcher did the, I think, rather nasty thing of identifying that and removing it from the mosquito. And he then watched mosquitoes feeding on and on until they literally exploded. And finally, the antennae, because to get you to do that feeding, the mosquito actually has to locate you in the first place. And the female mosquito has no less than 72 different receptors in her antennae, all of them picking up different types of chemical or heat signal to guide it to you. Incidentally, I say the female because it is only the female mosquitoes which feed on human blood. The males are altogether more innocent and feed on things like nectar and rotting fruit juices. I thought I'd throw in a little quiz here. Does anyone actually know who wrote the poem, "The female of the species is more deadly than the male"? Anyone remember who wrote it? It was Rudyard Kipling. Does anyone remember who made the record? The female, it's probably totally unacceptable now, and I shouldn't even raise it, but it was a big hit some years back. It was, my wife told me this, it was a group called Space. There you go. But I bet you could all sing it if I asked you to. Anyway, the fact that it's only the females that feed on blood gives you a clue as to the reason for the blood feed. The blood feed is essential for egg laying. And in most species of mosquito, the mosquito has to have a blood feed immediately before laying eggs. There are a few that don't, and this little distinction, technical like it sounds, becomes important later in my story. Some mosquitoes, which are called autogenous, they feed on blood, they don't need a feed immediately before laying, but I'll come back to that. Here in the UK, we have round about 34 different species of mosquito. They live in a variety of habitats, in woodlands, in wetlands, in gardens, and in my bathroom. But the question is, do any of them live underground? And to cut a long story short, my researchers found that yes, indeed, there is a population on the underground, and they have been there for no less than 70 years. In fact, they arrived with the Blitz. They arrived round about 1940 with the Blitz. Now, during the First World War, the government encouraged the use of the underground as shelters. They even had a slogan for it, shelters against the bombing from the Zeppelins. The slogan was bomb-proof down below. Come the Second World War, the government was initially very opposed, particularly Churchill, to the use of the underground as bomb shelters. They believed it would have a negative effect on morale. They thought there would be something called, what's called deep shelter mentality. In other words, that people, when they went down there, would refuse ever to come back up again. So the government did not initially allow the use of shelters, the underground as shelters. Some people got around that by, towards the end of the day, buying a penny halfpenny travel ticket and then just refusing to come up again at the end of the day. The Morning Star ran a big campaign in favour of the use of shelters. And there were even demonstrations outside underground stations. The biggest of them all was outside Liverpool Street Station. So early in 1940, the government relaxed its policy and allowed the use of shelters, of the underground as shelters. And by later in that year, by October, 125,000 people every night were using the underground as a shelter. Now, I think there is a kind of popular image of life in the shelters for its bonhomie as one long Cockney party. And indeed, there was an amazing community developed down there. As you probably know, people took down musical instruments, they took down old wind-up gramophone players. There were actually organised concert parties, and musical amateur dramatics took place. After a period, many of the underground stations had actually developed their own libraries. There were even canteen trains travelling from station to station. By the end of the war, the people in the canteen trains, this is a completely useless statistic for you, they estimated that they had delivered 545,454 gallons of tea. I'll say that again in case anyone is taking notes. 545,454 gallons of tea. So that's the kind of picture that we have of the life in the underground. Of course, the reality was wrong book. The reality was very different. Here's a little passage from the book describing. Now I've got this business of holding a microphone and reading from a book simultaneously. I realise why I had a lapel mic. Anyway, much of this rosy view of life on the underground arises from the effectiveness of government propaganda and still prevails today. The truth is, however, that despite the best efforts of many, conditions in the tube shelters were grim. People were packed unpleasantly close together, sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces, spreading coughs and colds, spreading coughs and colds, hardly able even to turn in their sleep, and fearful of what might be going on above. There was competition for places and fights over spaces, and sanitary conditions were appalling, with just a few L-SAN toilets or buckets shared between hundreds of people. The sanitary conditions actually, I have to admit, did improve over the years, but that's how it began, just buckets and L-SAN toilets, and hundreds of people trying to use them. According to Len Phillips, who lived through it as a child, the worst part was the smell of bodies and other unmentionable things. And you could hear everything that was going on at the top. You could hear the bombs, you could hear the guns that echoed down the lift shafts. I hated it, to be frank. It is the smell that figures too in the account of Evelyn Rose, also a child at the time. The stench was unbearable. The smell was so bad, I don't know how people did not die from suffocation. So many bodies and no fresh air coming in. Now, imagine those conditions. Imagine that description, and then remember what I said about the 72 receptors in the antenna of the mosquito. The stink, the sweat, the body heat. This was an open invitation to mosquitoes, and possibly mosquitoes for miles around. Some mosquitoes were evidently carried in the paraphernalia that people took down the tubes with them, because people began to take deck chairs and cushions and pillows and blankets, and so some of the mosquitoes would come in that way, but others were just able to detect all those chemical signals and make their own way. The first logged complaints of bites from mosquitoes came ironically from Liverpool Street underground station. But gradually it spread, and eventually I was able to find reports of complaints coming from as far afield as Clapham Station in the south and Hampstead underground station in the north. Yes, even Hampstead has mosquitoes. And so the London Underground, they sent some investigators down to look into this, and they found not just that mosquitoes were present, but the mosquitoes were breeding down there. They were, mosquitoes need water to breed, and they were breeding in the pools, in the tunnels, or pools that had formed under the inverts of station platforms. And eventually, the underground was to employ a force of 10 men specifically to go around, equipped with aerial sprays and compressors, specifically to tackle the mosquitoes on the underground, aerial disinfectants, all sorts of things. In fact, I found a lovely quote in one of their documents about about operating procedures, and it said, discontinue while shelterers are sleeping. Recommence during coughing period in the morning. I think that phrase, coughing period in the morning, sums up so much about what life in the underground must really have been like, a coughing period in the morning. There was a letter that went in 1941 from someone called the officer in charge of tube shelterers, and it was sent to all medical officers of health. And again, I've got to juggle the microphone with one hand and the book in the other. So I think I can do it. Here's a short quote from that letter. Measures are being taken to overcome the mosquito trouble at stations. Due to the rise in temperature caused by the presence of shelterers and the opportunity for mosquitoes to obtain a blood meal, the tubes have developed mosquitoes where none existed before. I'm glad to say that with the help of Dr. Stock and his mosquito experts, good progress is being made and the nuisance is well under control. Help will be afforded if upon hearing of any sudden recurrence at any station, you can arrange immediately to telephone the board building department. Time is of the essence in subduing these marauders, and upon receipts of the information, the mosquito staff will proceed to the spot at once. Now that letter, as I said, went to all the medical officers, medical health officers, and some of those must have been old enough to actually remember a time when malaria was actually still a disease in this country. Now, it may surprise you to know that malaria was endemic to England in particular, but in fact we only stopped recording annual malaria cases as recently as 1919. In fact, there were some we knew it as the ague, so you may have heard that word, or as swamp fever. The plasmodium that caused it was slightly less deadly than the tropical malaria, but nonetheless it caused a very unpleasant and debilitating condition, and some famous people suffered from it. Among them, Walter Raleigh. Walter Raleigh, you know, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth II, but when he went he eventually was imprisoned in the Tower and he was beheaded, and as he went to the block he said to the executioner, "I can feel a fit of malaria coming on, dispatch me quickly before people see me shivering and think that I'm afraid." Another sufferer was Charles II, and another sufferer was his arch nemesis Oliver Cromwell. You know, by the time of Cromwell they'd actually found not a cure but an amelioration for malaria in the form of quinine. Quinine comes from the bark of the quinoa tree, which was found in Peru, and the native Peruvians had taught the Jesuit priests there how to use it. So it was known as Jesuit powder. And on that basis, Oliver Cromwell refused to use it. He was not going to use, he said, any paper's powder, and he was not going to be Jesuited to death. So he died of malaria instead. But of course, it wasn't the rich and famous mostly, it was the poor who suffered from malaria. And there was a whole area of eastern England where malaria was endemic, and it stretched from East Yorkshire down through Lincolnshire, through the Wash, the Fens, East Anglia, Essex, the Thames Estuary, right up to London, down through Kent, Romney Marsh, Levels, Pevensey Marshes, that whole area, that lowland East England, where malaria was endemic. And I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to be fairly quick. But it actually features quite a lot in literature. And the most famous example, does anyone know what book where malaria or the swamp fever? It's in Charles Dickens. It's in Great Expectations. Thank you. And in those wonderful opening paragraphs, Pip describes it's on the North Kent marshes, and he describes the graveyard where his brothers and sisters are buried in a line of tombs of descending size. That description is based on a real site. It's based on the church of Cooling in North Kent, and if you go there are 14 lozenge-shaped tombs, getting smaller and smaller, and they are the children of just two families who died from the ague or the swamp fever. So it's a really present thing at that time in our history. It also crops up a little bit later in the chapter when he's standing in the mist over one of those tombstones, and suddenly rearing up from the other side is Magwitch, the convict, and from the description, Magwitch is obviously suffering from malaria. Magwitch, you may or may not remember, had escaped from the convict hulks moored on the Thames estuary. I said I wasn't going to talk about politics, but isn't it interesting how we are going back to our 19th century, well, you know where I'm going with that. Yes, so the convict hulks, and malaria was endemic on those hulks. On one boat just this year, 147 people caught malaria in just 3 months. Interestingly, there is a plant, there's a common plant called the red dead nettle, and on the North Kent marshes it has the local name of convict flower. And when I went down there, when I was researching, I know the North Kent marshes very well, when I was researching, I was looking for this plant and I couldn't see it anywhere on the North Kent marshes, which really puzzled me. And then I remembered that red dead nettle grows on soil that has recently been disturbed. So it would have grown on the hastily thrown up graves of the convicts who had died on those hulks and been buried there on the marshes. And that's why it got the name of convict flower. And I was pleased to notice it's got another name of archangel, so at least something was there to bless those forlorn graves in the North Kent marshes. I've got the wrong page in front of me, which doesn't really matter because I know it all by heart anyway. But so malaria was a big feature of life in this country. To go back, however, from that digression to the London Underground. At the end of the Second World War, the tubes empty, obviously, of shelterers, but complaints about mosquito bites still go on. They come from passengers on the train, they come from London Underground staff, and they particularly come from the people who have to walk the tunnels at night, the inspectors. But no one really takes much notice of them until someone from the University of London in the 1990s begins a piece of research. And she walks the tunnels and she collects specimens of mosquito and she takes them back to the lab and with a collaborator there, she takes protein samples of these mosquitoes. And it's published in a magazine, in a journal called Heredity in 1999. The mosquitoes that she collects are all of one species called Culex pipiens, but she finds out fascinating things about their lifestyle. There are populations of this mosquito, Culex pipiens, above ground and below ground, and they have developed really different ways of very different lifestyles. The ones above ground hibernate in winter. The ones below ground have dispensed with winter hibernation. The ones above ground, as you heard, form mating columns at mating season. The ones below ground just seek each other out individually and dispense with the columns. The ones above ground need a blood meal before laying eggs. The ones below ground are, what was the word? They're autogenous. But most significantly of all, the ones above ground don't feed on humans at all, they feed on birds. It is the ones below ground that have evolved for feeding on human beings and other mammals. The investigators, Burns their name was, it's just come back to me, they believe that there was a single colonising event, and after this the mosquitoes have evolved with amazing rapidity. And they think they've evolved so rapidly that eventually there will be different species of mosquito on different underground lines. There will be a Victoria line mosquito, a Central line mosquito, a Bakerloo line mosquito. I could go on, but I've run out of time. And this conclusion, I'm wrapping up as quickly as I can now, this conclusion is a really provocative and of great interest because it suggests that evolution is taking place at an unimaginable speed. Previously, it was always believed that evolution was a succession of very minor accumulation of minor changes taking place over a very long time, not just thousands, but millions of years. And yet here it is, seeming to take place within a single lifetime. So there was a huge amount of interest about this. Scientific papers, popular newspapers, popular magazines. I remember one of them, a magazine called Lateral in 2015, headlined it, "The Fastest Show on Earth." Now, I have no problem with challenges to orthodox Darwinism, and I hate to rain on what is quite an exciting parade, but that was not my conclusion. Because one of the great joys of writing is the research that you do, not just visiting places, but sitting in wonderful places like the British Museum, or the library at Kew, or the libraries of the Wellcome Institute, where I worked a lot. And then I was finding these other strange cases. For example, in 1923, a malariologist and entomologist, Percy George Shute, was asked to investigate a mosquito nuisance in central London, and he found on bedroom walls and ceilings Culex pipiens which were gorged on human blood. And more excitingly still, a man called John Marshall, who was a complete amateur, and if I had more time I'd love to, he's a fascinating man, I'd love to tell you more about his life story, but I can't. But he was a complete amateur who went on to become the world's leading authority on mosquitoes. And he wrote the definitive book, The British Mosquito. And in it, that book, he says, Culex pipiens never touch human blood. He even did an experiment where he got his assistant to sit in a cage with Culex pipiens for 5 hours, and he didn't once get bitten. I noticed it was his assistant who had to sit in the cage with the mosquitoes and not John Marshall himself. But later on, he had a kind of dancing moment, and he found cases of Culex pipiens feeding on human blood. And among others, he found these cases in hotels in Charing Cross and flats in Westminster, concentrated on a region around Trafalgar Square. So far from evolving in the tunnels, these human-feeding mosquitoes had already developed small populations above ground. So here, in conclusion, is what I think happened. During the Blitz, several species of mosquitoes find their way into the underground tunnels. Some carried in on a paraphernalia, others attracted by the chemical signals that the massed bodies are giving out. From the records we know there are at least 2 species, Theobaldia angulata, which is the one that I find in my bathroom, and Culex pipiens. But after the war, most of them die out, except these few Culex pipiens which have already evolved to feed on human blood. And they are in the stable conditions, the consistent warmth, with water for breeding and a constant food supply, everything they need for a permanent home, they hang on. And they have hung on to this day. There are all sorts of questions that leaves unanswered. Are they continuing to evolve? What status have they had since COVID? And most significantly, what are the males feeding on? No one seems to have asked that, because the females are feeding on blood. But what are these innocent males who feed on fruit juice and nectar? What are they feeding on in the underground? So there's, as with every one of these mysteries that I looked into, you find answers, but every answer leads to a further question. And on that idea that everything you look at, that the mystery itself is important.